Have you ever camped in the woods in the dirt? Did you hike with a stride that made your feet and knees hurt? Yet all you really wanted was to sit around the fire, but you can't build one now because of Smokey the Bayou. Give yourself a wine pour and join us online for the least haunted Campfire Club. It's the least haunted Campfire Club, so plug in your ears and cork up your gizzard and shut your eyes like the pinball wizard. It's the summer of 2022 and we got scary stories for you from a small coastal range in the mountains of California.
Hello, everybody. On behalf of myself and Garth, I want to welcome you to Season 3 of the Least Haunted Campfire Club. We're back for another summer of spooky tales and scary happenings and whatnot around this, our ever-changing, or maybe sometimes not changing, digital fire. It's been a crazy year since last summer, and that's an understatement. I know for a lot of us, the world that we live in is scary enough, but we hope that even though that is the case, you can still find some enjoyment in some of the fun and scary and interesting tales that we are going to bring to you this season. So without further ado, we're going to get into our first story. This story is called Lake Philadelphia. It is always a moment of shameful embarrassment when friends discover the fact that I, a grown person, am terrified of lakes. First, they usually misunderstand it as me not being able to swim, but this is not the case. Then they typically inquire if it is a fear of water in general. I inform them that I actually quite enjoy water. I like wading in creeks and rivers. And if you were to get me in the ocean, it would be hard to tell me apart from a seal when I play in the surf. But lakes? No way. I admit that my dislike of lakes is not evenly distributed, nor is it really too fair to say that I in fact hate lakes. I would gladly spend time fishing along a shore, or even maybe wading in about knee-deep. Anything beyond that, however, is too much. It is the going full in, as one might say, or going out on the lake in a boat that scares me. And it isn't even all lakes either. I have a particularly strong visceral revulsion at the idea of reservoirs. Not to say I'm against them, or at least not all of them. I can see their necessity in some situations. I understand how confusing and nonsensical my phobia seems to be, and even if I explained to my friends the real reason, it is not like anyone would ever believe me. That is why I'm using this opportunity to finally try and put down into words what I saw and experienced on the 4th of July in 1993. It's a funny thing when you look back on your childhood. Memories have a strange way of amplifying things. It is a common thing for a person to remember that when they were a child, the family went to the cabin every summer, but then later, on a careful cataloging of reminiscences, they are shocked to realize that the family only ever went to the cabin 2 times, and even then it had only been for a weekend at a time. That is how it is with me and my memories of my family's summer trips to Philadelphia Lake. The lake was not anywhere near the state of Pennsylvania. In fact, it was located in the High Sierra region of California. Philadelphia Lake was a reservoir, and it got its name because its construction in the 1930s had required the flooding of the small abandoned mining town of Philadelphia. The town of Philadelphia got its name from the mine that was located beneath it. In that area, mining claims usually took the name from either the hometown or home state of whoever staked that claim. That explained why a map of the area was littered with old ghost towns with names like Kentucky, Missouri, Chicago, Albany, etc. However, this was not the case with Philadelphia. The prospector who happened to make the strike that would become Philadelphia found his first nugget on the site on the 4th of July, which was why he first called the mine claim Independence. However, that name, as it would turn out, was already taken. So while trying to recollect what else he knew about July 4th, he settled on the name of the city in Pennsylvania where the nation was born. The mine soon birthed a city, or at least what passed for a city in those days and in those parts, what we like to call a boomtown. And, as was the case with many gold rush boomtowns, it was rife with filth, violence, crime, and money. Also, as was the case with many a gold rush boomtown, it only lasted a few years. By the beginning of the 20th century, the town was mostly abandoned. The U.S. Census of 1910 listed a population of 5 adults and a mule. In 1920, the mule had died, and all the residents save one had left. By 1930, the town was abandoned. With the passage of Roosevelt's New Deal policies, the valley in which Philadelphia, California sat empty was identified as the perfect location for a new hydroelectric dam. The resulting reservoir quickly became a popular destination for recreation. In the 1950s, it was briefly called the Switzerland of the Sierras. However, there are many lakes that also made this claim, so that doesn't really mean much. For a brief time, it was even rumored that Walt Disney himself was interested in buying the land for a ski resort. However, just as it was with the town of Philadelphia, the reservoir that bared its name was also soon forgotten by most. And by the 1990s, when my family would go there in the summers, it was well off the beaten path, which made it ideal for holiday camping trips and boating. No crowds and over 700 square miles of lake surface to ski an inner tube on. And that is just what my family did every year for the 4th of July, or at least what seems like every summer when you're 10. But it was in the summer of 1993 when the thing happened that would forever taint my perception of reservoirs and lakes in general. We were joined at the lake by my maternal grandparents and 3 of my older cousins. I was 10 at the time. And in the fashion of all 10-year-old cousins, I quickly became their shadow, a fact that the 3 teenagers despised. The night before the 4th, as we sat roasting marshmallows around the pine wood campfire and surrounded by the dark Tahoe National Forest, the adults and my older cousins took turns telling ghost stories. This activity is one that I'm sure few of you would find foreign or unordinary. And at first, in my young adolescent zeal, I found myself enjoying these supposedly spooky stories. For the first few were hardly worse than anything that I had read in Terrifying Tales to Tell in the Night or had seen on the old Dusk Area TV show. But then, slowly, the stories all began to revolve around strange occurrences on the lake. My father related how when he was a child and the reservoir was still a thriving resort lake, a boat full of teenagers out water skiing had failed to heed the weather warnings for the day. You see, in the High Sierra, thunderstorms can blow in suddenly, and these are intense storms. To get stuck out on the lake in such a thing, when the wind whips from shore to shore and water turns frothy with waves, could be deadly. And then add in the lightning strikes. According to his tale, the boat was caught in the middle of the lake, unable to make it to shore in the rough water. Suddenly, a bolt of lightning struck the small boat, instantly killing several of the teens. The few who weren't killed by the bolt clung to the burning and sinking craft for as long as they could before the raging lake swallowed them up. They never found half the bodies, or so the story concluded. Not to be outdone, my grandfather told his tale of horror on Philadelphia Lake. My grandfather had been an avid hunter in his youth. He had a few hunting partners who frequently spent deer season in the fall stalking the forested and lake-marked canyons of the High Sierra. The thing about the fall in the High Sierra is that just as with the sudden thunderstorms of summer, early winter storms could blow in suddenly with freezing temperatures and flurries of snow. And that was just what happened one November late in the deer season when my grandfather's friend Bob was out hunting on the shores of Philadelphia Lake. Moist, wet air had blown east from the Pacific Ocean, and forced abruptly upward by the steep and somewhat sudden Sierra Nevada range, the air cooled rapidly. When it met with cold, dry air moving west from the Great Basin, a blizzard formed right over the reservoir. Bob got lost in the storm and never came home. For 7 months, everyone wondered what had become of Bob in the blizzard. Then, in late May, after the last of the ice had melted from the surface of the lake, and the early summer boaters had begun to arrive, there was a particularly warm week. I remember that at this part of the story, my grandfather looked right across the crackling flames and locked eyes with me. "The thing about these lakes," he said, is that it gets real cold near the bottom, and it takes a long time for things that go down to come back up, especially anything that goes down in the winter, things like Bob. They don't come back up until the water warms enough to allow for bacteria to start to produce gases in them. Then they pop up at the surface like corks, and they bob. And at this twisted pun, he laughed. He laughed at the thought of his dead friend bobbing up and down, internal organs swelled like a party balloon in the water. My teen cousins found that it was the funniest thing they had ever heard. The final story actually came from my mother, and it wasn't very long and not particularly scary, or so I thought at the time, and it went something like this. The old town of Philadelphia was founded on the 4th of July when a miner found a gold nugget the size of his fist at the bottom of a narrow valley. Every year on the 4th of July, the town would celebrate not just the country's birthday, but also the town's. So every year on the 4th of July, the town's only church bell would ring out at the top of every hour. After the town was mostly abandoned, the last remaining residents maintained this tradition. Every year for 24 hours on the 4th of July, the bell would be tolled every hour. But then the town was abandoned, and shortly afterwards the dam was built and the town was flooded. But the thing was that when it was flooded, the town was not demolished. It was just flooded up along with everything else, including the mine, which means that in addition to the sunken town, there are now possibly hundreds of miles of man-made flooded tunnels down there. Some things that sink down there might just keep sinking forever. But the strangest thing is this. People say that every year on the 4th of July, if you listen for it at the right times, you can hear the bell tolling at the bottom of the lake. And that was where the stories ended, or at least the stories for those of us who were still children. So I was sent off to bed along with my cousins. That night, my dreams were filled with bloated and burnt bodies drifting to the surface of the lake as an ever-present bell tolled. At breakfast the next morning, I made the mistake of mentioning my nightmares from the night before. My older cousins immediately started teasing me about the lake. "Watch out, Pipsqueak, we're going tubing today. Don't let the bodies get you," one of them teased. Then one of them, I'm not sure which, decided what would be especially clever would be to start calling me Bob. And by the time when we were supposed to get on the boat for the day, they would look at me, then stretch out their arms to their side, roll their eyes back into their head, stick out their tongues, and then mime a slight bobbing motion. For the rest of the day, they teased me about what might be down in the lake. Looking over the side of the boat at one point, I could see the tops of drowned trees below us through the crystal clear water. "What you doing, Bob?" a cousin asked. "Looking for your friends?" We were on the lake for hours, everyone taking their turn being towed behind the boat on an old tractor tire inner tube. Every time I was offered a turn, I declined. After the nightmare, I had no intention of getting in that water, but the longer I put it off, the worse the teasing got. If I was hoping for my parents to intervene, I was sorely mistaken in my faith. It was a different time, and kids were almost expected to be slightly cruel as teenagers, and so there was nothing really to do but let kids be kids, as long as no one was hitting each other. But eventually, even 10-year-olds have their limits. I knew that if I did not get on that inner tube, then a lifetime of being called Bob lay ahead of me. I was going to have to do it. I could not, no, would not, give my cousins the satisfaction. So when it was my turn again, I mustered as much false bravery as I could and indicated that I was going to ride the tube. The boat drifted to a stop as my dad lowered the throttle. The motor, an older one that my dad had traded an old farm rototiller to a friend for, sputtered and died. As he began the process of trying to get the motor started again, my oldest cousin set about tightening my life jacket and helping me to lay face down on the overinflated rubber tube. The tube was attached to the back of the boat by about 50 feet of heavy cotton rope that would be paid out by whoever was sitting in the back of the boat. Once on top, I reached forward to grip 2 other rope hoops that had been tied on as handholds, and my cousin pushed the tube away from the back of the boat with their foot. As I slowly drifted back, my cousin called out, "Say hi to your friends for us, Bob!" Immediately, all of my barely existent courage evaporated. I was about to call out that I had changed my mind when suddenly the motor, which up until now my dad had been pulling repeatedly at the pull cord of, roared into life, and he let out a celebratory whoop as he jumped into the pilot's seat and raised the throttle. And soon all of my fear slammed into the bottom of my feet as the boat picked up speed. My cousin paid out the rope to its full length, and my dad opened the throttle fully. I heard a noise mixed in with the roar of the motor and the spray of water as the tube bounced and skidded over the surface of the water. It was an almost staccato barking sound that I soon realized was my own laughter. I was enjoying this. I was having so much fun that all thought of any bobbing corpses and drowned towns had been completely forgotten. My knuckles white from holding on so tightly, I opened my mouth wide and laughed with pure enjoyment. Soon the boat was passing over the middle of the lake. Suddenly it cut across the wake of another boat and caught some air. The inner tube followed right behind. How I managed to maintain my grip and not get thrown wildly from the tube and into the lake was a miracle. However, God is fond of a good joke, and so although I stayed on the tube, during the jostling, the rope tethered to the boat had either come undone or broken. The big bounce had knocked the wind out of me, and as I struggled to breathe, I became aware of the growing silence as the boat continued to roar off into the distance. And I noticed that I had almost completely stopped moving. I craned my neck to try and see where the boat had gone, and I could see it drifting to a stop a few hundred yards away. It seemed like they had noticed what had happened after all, and would soon come to get me. But then I noticed my dad jumping out of his seat and began pulling at the rope on the motor. He pulled repeatedly, but the motor refused to start. "Just hang on," he called across the water. "The motor won't start," he yelled, his explanation as if I hadn't noticed what was going on. So I just decided that I would try to stay calm and wait. But then I made the mistake of looking down. I saw maybe 20 feet or so below me the top of a long dead pine tree as I drifted along above it. I was moving. I looked up and could see that the boat and I were getting further apart, and I started to panic. But then my panic froze as I heard a new sound. Mixed in amongst the gently lapping of the water against the inner tube was the deep drone of a bell. But it was not in the air around me. It was coming from below, in the depths. Looking fearfully down again through the circle of the tube, I could see almost to the bottom of the lake due to the clear water. The lake being filled by snowmelt gave it an almost unbelievable clarity, and there, down in the green-tinted depths, I saw it. The town of Philadelphia. The cold water had preserved the town almost perfectly. Clapboard buildings lined a central street like an Old West movie set. I could make out what could only have been a series of saloons and mercantiles, even a few hitching posts. At the end of the street was the church with its tall spire. The tolling of the bell continued, but in long intervals. In amazement, I scanned over the remains of Philadelphia. In the main street, a rusted Ford Model A sat parked in front of one of the buildings. At first, I noticed an odd amount of what looked to be pieces of wood or even maybe moss-covered rocks that seemed to be strewn about the streets. But to my horror, I noticed that some appeared to have hands or shoes attached to strange twisted limbs. And then they began to move. Arms reached out to push off the bottom of the lake. They staggered to standing positions. I watched in dread as these random sunken bits of what I assumed to have been wood and stone revealed themselves to be human bodies. There were dozens of them, in various states of decay, men, women, and children, wearing a multitude of clothing styles spanning decades. They rose and began to move slowly through the streets of the town, as if going about everyday, normal business. I tore my eyes away to look back towards the boat. I could see the shape of my father still struggling over that dead motor. Looking back down through the water, the corpses, both skeletal and still fleshed, continued to drift through the town. They entered into storefronts, and one even sat down in the Model A as if it intended to drive off. It was almost surreally funny, or it would have been if they hadn't started looking up. One by one, the drowned people stopped their various activities in and about the town and started to look up at me. Some even raised their hands to point with missing fingers. Empty eye sockets, and in some cases milky white eyeballs, all turned in my direction. I dared to look back to the boat, hoping that I would hear the roar of the motor as it sprang to life and that the boat would come rushing to my rescue, but still, my dad was hunched over the motor. I looked down and my horror increased as the crowd of corpses had begun to shuffle about again, but all of them were moving to one specific spot, and that was right below me. The horde of rotting and fish-chewed people began to pile up and climb atop of each other, mounding up below me. I began frantically kicking my feet in an attempt to move myself closer to the boat and salvation, but no matter how hard I tried, I seemed to remain in the same place. Below me, twisted and ruined faces, bloated and green, screamed silently in rage in my direction as the growing pile strained and reached with bony claw-like hands towards me, straining to grab a hold of me and drag me down below to tear me apart or add me to their corpse citizenry. Suddenly, I heard the boat's motor catch and the familiar, albeit distant, whoop of triumph of my dad, followed by the opening of the throttle. But would they be in time? I reluctantly looked back towards the drowned town of Philadelphia, and the topmost dead face was only about 15 feet below me, reaching and straining, a lipless mouth with teeth gnashing. Closer and closer the pile grew. I squeezed my eyes shut tight, and then a hand grabbed a hold of me and lifted me up and dropped me into the still-moving boat. "Sorry, can't stop! The motor will die!" my dad called back at me as my cousins helped me off the floor and into one of the seats. If they were about to begin teasing me again, something about my face made them hold back. I could see that what they probably had thought were going to be witty and hilarious comments died in their mouths when I looked blankly at them. I didn't say anything else for the rest of the night, or at least nothing beyond monosyllabic answers or grunts of agreement. Even when the fireworks started over the water, I took no notice of the brightly colored explosions against a backdrop of endless high mountain stars. All I could think about was the army of the dead and angry faces below the water. Would they walk to the shore and come for me in the night? Should I tell my family? Would they even believe me? That night I didn't sleep a wink, and every twig snap, owl hoot, and rodent shuffling in the night set my heart beating fit to burst out of my chest. Eventually, the dawn came, and with it the packing and breaking of camp, as another 4th of July on the lake had come to an end. If my cousins called me Bob again that day, I don't remember, but I'm sure that they noticed that I never took my eyes off the lake, nor did I turn my back to it. That was almost 30 years ago, and I have never been back to Philadelphia Lake since. And as an extra precaution, I avoid lakes and reservoirs in general now. There are things in the deep waters of our world, things that I can't explain, but some things are not worth explaining. We might not like the answers we get. It's best to leave them down there in the depths. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us on our first episode of this third and new season. We welcome you to come back in 2 weeks, so Friday after next, for the next meeting of the Least Haunted Campfire Club. And if you want to share a story, please send it in to us. Send it in to leasthauntedpodcast@gmail.com. Recordings of yourself reading your stories, or even if you just type it up and want one of us to read it, you can do that. Or if you want to suggest a classic public domain ghost story that we can read, that's great too. Just write in again to the email and let us know. Also, we have a huge favor to ask. We started this Campfire Club 2 years ago when the pandemic started, and it was because we couldn't safely go out and camp and enjoy a campfire. And so we thought that we'd bring the campfire to all of you. Now here we are a few years later, and where Garth and I produce the show, we are in California, and the drought and the fire danger is too great for us to have campfires. So again, we cannot have campfires of our own. If you are in a place where you can have a campfire and you would like to share your campfire with us, please just take some footage of the campfire and send it into that same email address. We will feature it as the fire pit for that episode, and you will get attribution for your campfire. Maybe we'll send you a sticker or something. We'll work it out. But if you could help us out in that way, it'd be great. It would keep the show going. And anyway, bye.
It's the least haunted campfire club. The least haunted